We must defend the truth at all costs, even if we return to being only 12. St. John Paul II.
There are many moments in our lives when we seek answers from God but encounter only silence. What does it mean when He doesn't respond? God's silence can be unsettling and even painful, but in this video, we will explore how this silence is, in fact, a call to trust, intimacy, and spiritual growth. Throughout this video, we will see how God's silence is not absence, but an opportunity to deepen our faith and trust in His divine plans, even when we don't fully understand them. Chapter 1. God's Silence and Intimacy. When we face God's silence, we may feel as if He is distant or indifferent. However, this silence can be the beginning of something deeper. The example of Job, who endured great trials without immediate answers, shows us that God's silence is often an invitation to seek a deeper intimacy with Him. Even without understanding the reasons, Job did not abandon his faith, and in the end, he experienced a new revelation of God. In our lives, God's silence can function in the same way. It leads us to reflect on the depth of our relationship with the Creator. Sometimes we are so busy seeking answers that we forget to simply be with God in His presence. These moments of silence are opportunities to pause, listen, and rediscover what truly matters. Communion with Him. Silence forces us to confront our own limitations. It compels us to rely not on our own strength, but on divine providence. When Job lost everything, he was led into a state of total dependence on God. This experience brought him to a level of intimacy he had never known before, showing that in the midst of silence, we can grow in unexpected ways. Often, the answer we seek from God is already within us. During periods of silence, He teaches us to look inward and find His truths imprinted on our souls. The journey of faith becomes richer when we are able to find God in the subtleties, in the small gestures, and in moments of apparent absence. It is in these times that true intimacy is revealed. We must not despair when silence seems to last. The process of drawing closer to God can take time, and silence is an essential tool to purify our desires and our faith. The absence of quick answers prepares us for a deeper and more transformative experience with the Lord. Just as Job was rewarded with a new vision of God after all his suffering, we too can look forward to divine revelation. God's silence, therefore, is not the end of the dialogue, but the beginning of a new phase of communication, where He speaks through stillness, waiting for our faith to mature. God desires that we come closer to Him, trusting even when we cannot hear His voice. True intimacy with God happens when we are able to find Him, not in the answers, but in the silent trust we develop in His presence. Chapter 2. Silence and total dependence on God. When God remains silent, it may be a call to increase our total dependence on Him. The prophet Habakkuk faced a similar situation. He cried out to God for answers amid a crisis, but the response did not come as expected. Nevertheless, Habakkuk chose to continue trusting, even without seeing the changes he desired. He understood that true faith is not based on immediate answers, but on trust in God's character and faithfulness. Depending on God in moments of silence reminds us that we are not masters of time or circumstances. Instead of trying to control the situation or demand answers, we are called to rest in the Lord. This is a painful process for many, but in this surrender we learn to rely completely on God's will, not our own. Habakkuk did not receive immediate answers, but he ended his journey praising God, even amid the lack of visible answers. God's silence teaches us to wait, not with anxiousness or doubt, but with a serene trust that God is in control. When we don't receive the answer we want, or when time seems to stretch beyond what we imagined, we learn to lean fully on God's grace. This absolute dependence is a test of faith that strengthens us spiritually. As we let go of our need for quick answers, we learn that true strength does not come from external circumstances, but from the inner certainty that God is at work, even if we cannot see it. Silence forces us to seek a deeper relationship where our security lies in God, not in the immediate solutions we often crave. Habakkuk exemplifies this trust when he declares that even if the fig trees do not blossom and the fields do not produce, he will still rejoice in the Lord. This is the essence of total dependence on God, a faith that is not shaken by circumstances but remains firm in the certainty that God is sovereign and knows what is best for us. This unshakable trust is what sustains us in moments of silence. Dependence on God is refined in silence. We learn to live by faith, not by sight. Every moment of waiting is an opportunity to draw closer to God, trust more deeply in His plans, and place our concerns in His hands. Silence, then, is not an absence of response, but an invitation to trust fully in the one who never fails. Chapter 3. God works in the silence. While God's silence may seem like an absence of action, the truth is that He works powerfully, even when we don't realize it. The story of Lazarus illustrates this reality well. When his sisters, Martha and Mary, called for Jesus, He did not come immediately. His silence in the face of their urgent request may have caused frustration, but Jesus knew exactly what He was doing. What seemed like a delay was actually preparation for an even greater miracle. During the time we wait for a response from God, He is working behind the scenes, setting the stage for something we cannot see at the moment. Just as in Lazarus' case, where Jesus waited until he had been dead for 4 days before raising him, God often allows us to go through periods of silence to prepare us for the manifestation of His glory. Silence, therefore, does not mean inactivity, but rather a time of maturation and growth. God works in the silence in ways that defy our understanding. His vision and plans are far greater than ours, and what we interpret as a delay may actually be the necessary time for His purposes to be fulfilled perfectly. Faith involves believing that, even without seeing what is happening, God is working for our good. His providence is silent, but immeasurably effective. The waiting periods can be painful, but they are essential for us to witness God's actions in their fullness. If Jesus had healed Lazarus immediately, the miracle of resurrection would not have occurred. Often, the miracle God has planned for us requires time, silence, and trust. We cannot rush God's plans. We must trust in His perfect timing. During these silent periods, God is also working within us. He transforms our hearts, adjusts our perspective, and shapes us to receive what He has for us. The time of waiting is not wasted, it is a period of preparation. Every day of silence is a day in which God strengthens us to be ready for the challenges and blessings to come. When we finally witness what God was preparing in the silence, we understand that the wait was necessary. Just as the miracle of Lazarus' resurrection revealed God's glory in a powerful way, the silence we experience before the answers is the prelude to something greater. Our task is to trust, knowing that God's silence is filled with divine activity that will be revealed at the right time. Chapter 4. The mystery of God's silence. God's silence is not something easily understood. There are moments when, no matter how much we cry out, the answer seems not to come. This mystery can be deeply frustrating and even anguishing. However, even in His own pain, Jesus experienced this mystery. On the cross, as He bore the weight of humanity's sins, He cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Matthew 27:46. In that moment, God's silence echoed, but it was part of the greater plan of redemption. This silence, experienced by Jesus, is perhaps one of the most unsettling moments in sacred history. Even the Son of God was not spared from experiencing the silence of His Father. This fact reveals that God's silence is not synonymous with abandonment or rejection, but is part of a larger mystery that involves complete trust in the divine plan. Jesus, even without hearing a response, trusted in God until the end, committing His Spirit into the Father's hands. For us, the mystery of God's silence can also be a test of faith. Sometimes we are called to trust when we do not understand. Just as Jesus trusted in the Father in His most difficult moment, we are invited to do the same. God's silence does not mean He is not present, but that He is calling us to believe, even without seeing or hearing. The experience of silence reminds us that God is sovereign and His plans are greater than we can imagine. However, the lack of immediate answers forces us to surrender our will and trust completely in divine wisdom. The veil of mystery remains, and God's silence challenges us to go beyond human logic, embracing pure faith. We do not need to understand every detail of God's plan to trust Him. Jesus showed us that even when God is silent, He is working to fulfill His eternal purposes. The cross, which seemed like a failure to the world, became the triumph of salvation. The silence was in fact the space where God's victory began to manifest. Thus, the mystery of God's silence teaches us that our faith does not depend on immediate answers or clear explanations. Sometimes the greatest demonstration of faith is simply continuing to trust, even when heaven seems silent. God's silence can be disconcerting, but it is also an invitation to delve deeper into the mystery of His will and His love. Chapter 5. God's Silence and Spiritual Growth. God's silence is often a call to spiritual growth. When God does not immediately answer our prayers, He gives us the opportunity to deepen our faith and reflect on the condition of our hearts. Rather than seeing silence as an absence, we can view it as a sacred pause, where we are invited to examine our lives and our relationship with Him. This period of reflection may be the time when we draw closest to God. Jesus taught us to seek the Father in secret, as in Matthew 6:6, where He tells us to pray in the quiet of a room, away from distractions. This practice creates an intimate space to hear God's voice, which often does not manifest in audible words, but in an inner presence. God's silence teaches us to tune our hearts to His, helping us discern His will more deeply. Silence is fertile ground for growth. In silence, we are challenged to develop patience, trust, and humility. The process of spiritual growth is not instantaneous, and the moments when God seems distant may be exactly when we are being shaped the most. The lack of immediate answers can motivate us to seek more intensely, depend more deeply, and trust more fully. Additionally, silence gives us the opportunity to see ourselves more clearly. Without constant noise, we are confronted with our fears, doubts, and weaknesses. This confrontation is essential for spiritual growth because only when we recognize ourselves as we truly are can we be transformed by God's grace. Silence, then, is a mirror that reflects our true spiritual condition. As we grow spiritually, we begin to see that God's silence is not a punishment, but an invitation to maturity. He pulls us out of our comfort zone, forces us to abandon our dependence on quick answers, and leads us to a deeper trust in His plan. Silence ultimately strengthens our faith as we learn to trust God not just for His words, but for His constant presence, even when invisible. The spiritual growth fostered by God's silence equips us to face life's challenges with greater serenity and confidence. Our perspective changes, and what once seemed like an absence now becomes a quiet and powerful presence. This spiritual maturity is the greatest gift that silence can give us, the ability to walk by faith and not by sight, trusting that God is always with us even when we cannot hear Him. God's silence can be one of the greatest challenges of spiritual life, but it is also one of the greatest opportunities for growth. When He seems distant, it is at that moment that we can draw closer to Him, developing a deeper faith and an unshakable trust in His purposes. As we have seen throughout this video, God is always working, even in silence, shaping our hearts and preparing us for something greater. If this topic touched your heart, and you want to continue deepening your spiritual journey, consider becoming a member of our channel. By becoming a member, you help us create more content like this. And you also receive early access to videos that can further assist in your growth in faith. And don't forget to watch the video on the screen. We're sure you'll enjoy it. May God bless you.